Thank you, Senator Hanson. Senator McKenzie.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy President. I rise to place on the record my concerns about a pattern of activity around the office of the member for Melbourne Ports, Michael Danby. This involves claims spanning a decade that he housed a taxpayer-funded dirt unit in his electorate office. On the 25th of November last year, journalist Brad Norrington with Rosie Lewis published a story in The Australian revealing that a blogger by the name of Peter Wicks, who runs a website called WikiLeaks, is actually a taxpayer-funded staffer working for the member for Melbourne Ports. Mr Wicks' WikiLeaks website claims to be independent, but it often smears members of the Labor Party, the Greens, Coalition and others, whilst promoting certain Labor factional players like Senator Kitching. According to the story, Wicks is close to new Labor Senator and Danby ally and now Senator Kimberley Kitching, as well as being close to Ms Kitching's husband, Andrew Landrieu, the backroom operator, former blogger and friend of Labor leader Bill Shorten. According to The Australian, and I quote, "Mr Wicks has not disclosed his role as a paid political staffer on his WikiLeaks website."
Senator McKenzie, point of order.
Senator to refer to senators and members of the House of Representatives by the correct titles.
I would remind speakers to use the appropriate salutations.
Okay, that would be Labor leader Mr Bill Shorten.
Thank you, Senator McKenzie.
Nor has he revealed his personal ties to Senator Kitching and Mr Landrieu, both firm backers of Mr Shorten's dominance of the ALP right faction in Victoria. Senior ALP and union readers of Mr Wicks' blog site say it has become more clearly identifiable lately as propaganda for Mr Shorten's side of politics. They suggest it could serve as a front for Mr Landrieu, who closed down his own poison pen Vex News website in 2013 at Mr Shorten's request, but could be back in business if he was using WikiLeaks as a new outlet. Vex News talked up Mr Shorten while publishing allegations against people regarded as critics or opponents. "You can see the hand of Landrieu in some of the latest posts," one reader claimed. Melbourne ABC radio broadcaster John Fain said during one of Ms Kitching's earlier bids for a prize Labor seat in 2013 that she bought baggage with her husband. There are many people intimidated by Andrew Landrieu and the way he uses Vex News to bully and undermine and ruin people's reputations, Fain said. The Australian sought comment from Mr Wicks about his dual roles as a blogger and a political staffer and whether he was receiving assistance with his blog. A fellow staffer in Mr Danby's Melbourne office said Mr Wicks was in a meeting and not available, possibly for hours. Mr Wicks did not return later calls. Mr Danby defended the blog and praised Mr Wicks' communication skills in his role as an electorate officer. "As a zealous champion of free speech, I, of course, will do nothing to interfere with his highly regarded blog writing, although, of course, expect that this would only ever be done in his own time, not whilst at work," Mr Danby said. And that ends the excerpt from The Australian. Mr Danby subsequently wrote a letter to the editor stating that, since joining his staff in October, Wicks had only blogged 3 times and not during work hours. Mr Danby's letter to the editor does not conclusively refute the claims that Mr Wicks' blogs are simply a private activity. If one looks at Wicks' posts since his employment by Mr Danby, 3 out of 5 are devoted to defending Kimberley Kitching and the HSU's Diana Asmar from media criticism, or attacking Cathy Jackson, hardly causes removed from the factional interests of his employer, Mr Danby. Before commenting on the member for Melbourne Port's history of hosting such operators in his office, I wish to examine the relationship between Mr Danby and Kimberley Kitching's errant husband, Andrew Landrieu. Mr Landrieu's often dubbed
point of order.
Senator Kitching is entitled to be referred to by her correct title.
I would remind Senator McKenzie to use correct titles.
My apologies. Senator Kitching is notorious for his Vex News blog, which operated from 2008 to 2013. Vex News claimed to be first with the worst. It was an amalgam of defamation, vendetta, rumour and fiction, often aimed at opponents of the Shorten faction, who by contrast were promoted. There is no doubt that the member for Melbourne Ports is a political ally of the Landrieux. Indeed, Mr Danby acknowledged Landrieu's help in his maiden speech to Parliament in 1998. After the recent federal election, Andrew Landrieu and David Asmar, along with 2 other men, were arrested for allegedly vandalising Greens and Liberal polling material at multiple polling stations from Elwood to Port Melbourne, allegedly driving at volunteers who tried to stop them. Fairfax media reported at the time that the men had been released without charge but were still being investigated. I understand this matter is presently before the court, so I will not comment further. But according to Fairfax, and I quote, Mr Landrieu is understood to be a personal and political confidant of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Bill Shorten. All 4 men were heavily involved in the election campaign of Michael Danby and the Labor MP for Melbourne Ports, who fought a close 3-way contest to eventually declare victory in a campaign he described as ugly. So it is clear that not only are there strong links between the member for Melbourne Ports and the Landrieux, but also between Landrieux and the opposition leader Bill Shorten. The member for Melbourne Ports has been an unashamed booster of Senator Kitching's ambitions to attain a Senate seat, regaling ABC viewers with a tale of her using agro-like sleuthing abilities to clean up the HSU, which has subsequently been debunked. And everyone knows that Senator Kitching's Senate candidacy was supported behind the scenes by Mr Shorten. One might be tempted to dismiss the member for Melbourne Ports' association with both Peter Wicks and Andrew Landrieu as just poor judgment about staff and associates, were it not the fact that Peter Wicks' exposure as a part of a dirt operation centred around Mr Danby's office is actually a case of history repeating itself. In 2006, another taxpayer funder advisor to Mr Danby was accused of blackening the names of MPs and compiling dirt files on them. Specifically, Dr Adam Carr, who worked for Mr Danby, was accused of doctoring the online biographical entries of dozens of Labor MPs and Liberals, including Treasurer Peter Costello and Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. 2 Labor MPs, Julia Irwin and Jenny George, complained to the then opposition whip, Roger Price, that Dr Carr had placed unpleasant biographical matter about them on Wikipedia. According to an article in the Sunday Herald Sun, Ms Irwin, the then member for Fowler, said she believed Dr Carr was getting dirt on people, and I quote, "People who are ALP staffers should not be doing this type of thing," she said. Ms George, the member for Throsby and a former ACTU president, is believed to have complained that Dr Carr wrote she was a member of the Communist Party in 1970s. The entry was later changed to describe her as an alleged former member. The whip would not comment, but it is believed he warned Mr Danby to rein in his staffer. At the time, the member for Melbourne Ports denied the allegation, and Mr Clark claimed that while he had edited many MPs' Wikipedia entry, Ms Irwin's Wikipedia entry had been changed by an anonymous user. Despite his denials about Adam Carr's activities, Mr Danby has shown himself more than eager and willing to use his material when it suits him. In 2011, Mr Danby became involved in a war over edits to Senator Lee Rhiannon's Wikipedia page, with user Intelligent Mr Toad duelling with New South Wales Green staffer Chris Maltby over Maltby's attempts to expunge details of Senator Rhiannon's communist past. In Parliament, Mr Danby denounced both Maltby and Senator Rhiannon, but did not refer to Intelligent Mr Toad, who was editing Senator Rhiannon's Wikipedia page to include the references being expunged. The thing is that Intelligent Mr Toad was an alias used by Adam Carr, although he had at this time been removed from Mr Danby's payroll onto David Feeney's. If one was so inclined, one could trace an unbroken line of defamation linked to the member of Melbourne Ports, starting with Adam Carr and continuing up to today with Peter Wicks. The unfortunate thing about the activities of Mr Carr and Mr Landrieu and Mr Wicks is that truth is often dispensed in favour of smear. To call it muckraking is rating it too highly. And so the thing is, such online operations being deployed not so much against the coalition but against the internal opponents of the Shorten faction, as well as Labor's Green rivals. That is when they are not being used to promote friends of the faction, such as Senator Kitching. It's no wonder Labor has been on the brink of exploding over such shenanigans. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKenzie.